This is the scale and axis lecture for the beginning typography class. And in this lecture, we will discuss effective use of scale and extreme scale, as well as the use of axis to activate and create interesting layouts. Both of these will apply to sections of the Type Fundamentals book. Scale is an important tool we use to create strong hierarchy and a clear focal point. It is probably the most common method to creating hierarchy, and when exaggerated, we refer to it as extreme scale. It's really an essential tool that we use as designers when we create layouts. When we want to create something that is interesting, we oftentimes are seeking variety. And by playing with scale and juxtaposing different scales, whether it be typography or imagery or illustration, we're able to create a lot more interest for the viewer. This goes all the way back to the beginning. If we look at examples of letterpress or playbills and posters and things from the Victorian era, we see this emphasis on scale and this desire to use scale to draw the viewer in, to emphasize what they want read, and to help direct the order of how the hierarchy is read. We also see this in modern day or contemporary editorial design, like this example, this booklet that has interesting scale play that helps us see these titles, these subheads. There's pull quotes that are slightly larger than the body copy. All of these scale juxtapositions allow us to see a clear prioritization of content. Here's another one with this large pull quote over the face of Aaron Draplin that really draws you in, and then this title on the right-hand side that then leads you into the Q&A itself. We also see scale play with imagery. This is a great example of a spread from a magazine that's at a hotel, and you'll see this play of images where there's images that are juxtaposed in different scales and sizes, and it really creates interest. If all of these images were the same size, they wouldn't be quite as dynamic. This layout would not be quite as interesting to the viewer, but it's that scale play and that juxtaposition and prioritization of these images that creates interest. Here's another example, these exercise spreads. You can really see strong scale play here from the headline and then to the captions and then the pull quotes and the different sidebar information. There's really strong hierarchy here that lets us really see what information needs to be read in what order, and it really helps prioritize and create interest. These different components and different scales of typography are really what makes this feel interesting to the viewer. Here's a simpler one, another hotel magazine or newspaper where you see on the left this urban stay. Large, bold typography that draws you in, and then smaller type that keeps you on the page to continue to read more content. We see this in packaging as well. Hierarchy is very important in packaging. It helps us establish what we're looking at and understanding the different varieties or types of packages that are in a set. But here it really helps us understand the priority of how we should read this information. It helps us understand what this product is and why do we care about it. And is it the correct one that we potentially want to purchase or buy? We've talked about menus in the hierarchy lecture, but those become really important when we're talking about scale. A lot of times menus rely on scale to really draw you in and help you see these different sections. You know, when we're looking at this menu for Russ and Daughters, we can see noshes and boards and caviar and herring and platters and eggs. That's really going to help us define and hone in on what section we're interested in looking at. And then we can look at the different items and determine ultimately what do we actually want to order. So it's a wonderful menu design by Kelly Anderson. You can really see the emphasis of scale that's really helping create strong hierarchy here and letting us understand how to navigate this menu. Sometimes scale can be more subtle and sophisticated, like with this example, this wine card. You can see that there's not a lot of scale play. The largest type is not too much larger than the smallest type, but this creates a more sophisticated typesetting. It creates something that's a little bit more quiet, not quite as loud, and that's sometimes what we're after. Sometimes you really want to create a small juxtaposition in scale to create something that's maybe a little bit more delicate, a little more elegant. As opposed to this, where we're really playing with large type, this DOWN for down. It's becoming large. It's almost playing inside of the image to create something that's really interesting. And then some more standard scale play on the right that really helps draw us into this article. So then we also have what we call extreme scale, and that's where letter forms really become so large that they become imagery. Here's this example again, this 62 to 72, where this type becomes so big that it bleeds off the edge and it really becomes imagery. And this is a powerful tool and something that you'll want to explore on this assignment. We're going to really explore scale and extreme scale. So as you're sketching and creating these compositions, we want to see both being explored. Here's another example of extreme scale that we've seen before, this really large KAFE that bleeds off the back. The type becomes image-based. It bleeds so much that you're really looking at the details of these letter forms. We can still read it, but it's almost becoming image as it integrates with the cup and the other coffee stains. Here's some work from Fred Woodward, a very famous art director, one of the masters of editorial design. So here we have, again, extreme scale with this big shot. And they've even played with this tire or inner tube that is substituting for the O, that's really playing up that strong, big scale of typography. So it's very playful, but a great example of extreme scale. We'll see more of his work as well. Here's some work from the New York Times where they're really working with this condensed typeface that was commissioned and used for this section specifically to get the type to be as large as possible. Because when we have condensed type, we're able to make it even bigger because it takes up less space, especially in a vertical format like a newspaper. And this is really about real estate. This is about New York City, so it's about skyscrapers and tall buildings. So there was an emphasis to really want to have this very, very large play of typography inside of the magazine. Here's another example where the P is so large it's actually becoming a container. So we're actually setting type inside of this P. Really interesting solution utilizing extreme scale. And some others from the same magazine. Here's somewhere where the letter forms are large. And sometimes the letter forms don't have to be that big. It's more about the juxtaposition to the smallest type. So here there's a nice extreme scale play between these large letter forms and then these smaller pieces of type. Here's another one where instead of the type going inside of the letter, it fits within some of the negative spaces between the letters. Between that L and U, there's this nice little band of body copy. But again, this large PLUM that really becomes the extreme scale that creates interest, creates imagery out of the typography. So scale creates a lot of interest for the viewer. It's a really important tool that we use. And when pushed to the extremes, large type becomes image and allows us to appreciate the intrinsic details designed into every letter form. So axis is a method that can activate a layout. It gives movement and can even feel chaotic. Using tight gridded type can be important to making axis layouts successful and readable. And this first example is a great one. You can see how the type really interlocks. The designer specifically used complementary angles so that things line up. The way that the portfolio by David Bailey is on an opposite angle to the New Beat Poets. And then that same angle from David Bailey is utilized for that little bit of body copy that starts with GQ presents an exclusive collection. So they've really locked these things together. And that's a really good technique when you're playing with axis and something that I definitely want to see explored in your layouts. Because oftentimes axis can feel chaotic. And to give it rationality and to make it feel more organized, we often play with defined angles. We want to avoid arbitrary angles as much as we can. Using 45s and 60 degrees and 30-degree angles are really ideal because they're not quite as extreme and feel more intentional. This is Paula Scher. She's a partner at Pentagram in New York and is a master of using axis. So much of her work involves heavy use of typography, and frequently we see a lot of axis work. Here's some of her famous work for the public theater, where you can see this interlocking of typography and this fun axis play that creates a lot of energy for these pieces. It's a really good use of axis because the subject matter is so energized in this bring in the noise, bring in the funk, that we really want to play up that through the typography and the way that these pieces are designed. Here's another one of her pieces that's maybe a little bit more subdued, but with this wonderful axis work that connects all of these names together. Now we're not playing here with such diagonal axis, but this still counts as axis and is really successful for the subject matter. Here's more of Fred Woodward's work. So you can see this play with axis, this cool jerk. Here we have even extreme scale because we're running this tiny type within the letter forms, but then this wonderful slight angle that runs this text across the spread. Here's another one for Tracy Morgan, this really playful type on the right. This is another one that I would consider more chaotic. Again, they're not playing with the complementary, simple angles. It's creating something that's a little bit more crazy. Or something like this that's more subdued, more of Fred's work from GQ magazine. You can see the way they're running type up to reference the skyline. This was for when the very first Spider-Man movie came out. Here's a wonderful piece by Bethany Heck, where really if you look at this, most of the type is on the same angle. We're just really dealing with two angles, and if you can imagine, it's almost like the entire thing was turned 90 degrees. And that can be a good strategy to use for this as well. Maybe you want to design something in a straightforward way, lock everything together, and then rotate it as one piece, maybe on a 45 or a 90-degree angle, and you'll find you get really interesting effects. Here's some pieces that we saw before that involve axis. The one on the left where there's a radial axis as these things run across, right? All of these shows that they're referencing, Arrested Development, Lost, The Office. Or on the right, this table of contents that again plays with complementary angles. These things lock together in a nice way that allows all the white space to move to the outside. It allows this image area in the middle to become really interesting and activated. So it's something, again, that's important, those complementary angles and how you connect these things together to make them feel like a cohesive whole. Here's one that was fun, a cover of a magazine where they actually ran the title up the side. It's a really interesting way to make it feel a little bit more odd, a little bit more funky, and it has a very nice appeal for the audience of this magazine. This was a poster for Inside Man, a movie that came out quite a while ago, but it was a very striking poster when it was first released because it really relied on axis. Again, we're seeing those complementary angles, we're seeing this locking up of content to the middle, and then this wonderful use of white space. The decision to have all of these different diagonal elements meet together in the middle really activated the white on the outside of where all the imagery and the typography is. And it was really striking. It really stood out when it was released because it looked nothing like any of the movie posters that were out or really have come out since. This is an example of one that really is using axis to create chaos, and that's something that you might want to explore, but for the most part, we're really after readability and legibility on this assignment, so we want to make sure that things are readable. But this is a great example where you can see that although they're using complementary angles, by pulling these pieces apart, by not locking them together, by keeping things spaced out in an unusual way, like wire, how there's weird spacing between those letter forms, that plus the axis play is really driving to create something that's a little bit more disjointed, more deconstructed, more chaotic. As opposed to something like this that's more functional and rational. Here we have a very simple small piece of axis play where we're running these city names on a 90-degree angle. So San Francisco, London, Stockholm. And that's really to solve a space issue. They're able to fit a longer word if they run it vertically like that than as opposed to running it horizontally. So here it's really solving a specific problem, which axis oftentimes can help us with. Here's one where we're locking up type. Oftentimes we'll see this when we're playing with axis, is all of the letters are locking together. All of these words are set in a way that they connect and create this square-like shape. And then it's just slightly rotated and put up in the corner of this packaging for wine. This label is really interesting in that it really relies on axis and this locking up of all of this type together. Or on this tag, really interesting use where part of the tag is running horizontally and then the part at the bottom runs vertically. And that's really useful here because when you first arrive at the tag, you're going to see the vertical type at the bottom, the 37, which is the size. And that's really the first piece of information you're going to want as you start looking at this pair of shoes. But then if you're interested, you can turn it around and read the material and the other kinds of information that are important about the shoe. So here the axis is also really working with the orientation of the tag and how the viewer would interact with it, and then ultimately determining the order of how they'll receive this information. So when working with axis, it's important to make clear decisions. Again, you want to work with clearly defined angles. Angles like 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees. We want to avoid slight angles as it will create more chaos. We also want to use angles that complement each other when working with multiple angles at once. We want to avoid having arbitrary random angles mixed together because again that's going to create more chaos, and although that's something I'm interested in seeing you explore, for the most part we're going to want to pick and select layouts that are a little bit more functional and readable than the ones that are going to be more chaotic for this section. So hopefully that helps and gives you some information and ideas to help you start working on these two sections of the Type Fundamentals book.